Hi everyone. I would like to welcome all of you to my screencast today. And by everyone, I mean everybody who I have endured the past 3 years with at OWP in my own cohort, all of my teachers who have really greatly inspired me to become a better teacher, and any former graduate of the MIT program at Miami University. So today, I would like to begin by apologizing for my absence. I am 38 and a half weeks pregnant, and I figured it was probably a really good idea to pre-record this today, just in case medical problems or stress or anything else that happens when you are about a week away from having a baby, if anything like that kicks in, and sure enough, it has. So I'm fine, my baby's fine, but I am growing a very large baby. Just 2 weeks ago at my 36 weeks ultrasound, I was told I already have an 8.5 pound baby. So it really could be here any minute, any day, and I'm really excited, but that is why I'm unable to attend the OWP Masters Presentation Conference today. Today, what we will be talking about in my presentation is how providing guided reading choices and writing choices to my students helped to make my year such a better experience, and not just my year, but also for my students too. So as we go ahead and get started, I'm going to switch to a screencast now where you're not going to see my lovely face anymore. And I'm going to focus on all the content that I acquired this year and all the knowledge and all my data. So here we go. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoy and learn. So as I said, the topic of my research is providing guided reading and writing choices to my students and the effect it had on them throughout the year. What really inspired me to do this was Kelly Gallagher's book, Read-A-Side. A couple summers ago, I found myself sitting in a classroom in Bachelor's Hall and thinking, man, oh man, have I been killing my students' love of reading for over 10 years. It was a huge moment of guilt for me. So what did I do? I decided to make a change. I wanted to provide my students with more choices in their reading. And eventually, this led me to writing as well. And I'll explain that later. So you might be asking, how was I killing my students' love of reading? Well, for over 10 years, I was a guilty teacher of following the kill a reader casserole, where I take a novel, Lord of the Flies for example, and we slice and we dice it into so many different pieces. Here I was thinking I was being a great, thorough, comprehensive teacher, but in reality, that wasn't happening. I was making my students use sticky notes, throw in a couple worksheets here and there, you better add some more sticky notes, and basically the whole novel was never really read cohesively, and it was all just read in choppy bite-sized chunks. No wonder they never liked it. Luckily, Gallagher, he helped me. He provides 3 ingredients to building a reader, which inspired me to make huge changes in my classroom. As you can see, he believes that we must have interesting books to read, students must have time to read the books inside of school, and they must have a place to read their books. Now, all 3 of those things really helped me to determine what I was going to do next. For my research question, due to Read-A-Side, I came up with, how does providing guided choices in reading and writing improve engagement and growth? Now what I did was I had 3 steps to my plan. The first thing I was thinking is, how can I come up with some ideas to improve my students' reading desire and their engagement? And then, like I mentioned before, I thought about writing. I was probably killing their love of writing as well. So Write-A-Side is my own term, inspired by Read-A-Side. And I wanted to come up with ways to improve my students' attitudes toward writing and to help them develop their voice. Because really, when I was reading their papers, everyone sounded the same. Okay, no one was unique. Everyone was just kind of following a formula, and I didn't like it. And then finally, what I realized I had to do is I had to restructure my class time to meet the outcomes of my goals. Selfishly, I had been a teacher where I feel like my classroom was more teacher-centered than it was student-centered, where I was the leader and I was always telling the students what to do. And I knew I needed to change that in order for my students to achieve all that they could in reading and in writing. So here is my brand new schedule that I came up with because I knew I had to do this in order to truly allow my students to experience reading and writing the way that they should. Everything you see in red are the changes that I made for reading. Everything you see in green are my writing changes, and black is just my normal operations. So as you can see, we are double blocked. We have about close to 100 minutes with students, the same group every single day. Now, the reason why I structured this the way that I did is I knew I had to give my students their own time to read and write, so I purposely planned to give them their time in the first block of class. Because selfishly, I knew that if my lesson wasn't going well, or if I got a little distracted and went off on another tangent or something like that, I would take away their own reading and writing time. So by putting their reading and writing time first, I felt like that is what needed to be done. The very first thing that I did was IRB, and that stands for Independent Reading Book. I wanted to create an independent reading program for my 7th graders. I felt that by doing this, I would be giving them a lot of choice over what they read, as well as not participating in the Kill a Reader casserole that I showed you earlier. So how I went about restructuring this program, or creating this program, was I reached out to a local teen librarian at our public library. I figured that this person would have read so many more books than what I have read, especially since I have only been teaching 7th grade for 3 years. All of my prior experience was high school. So once I found out she was on board to help give quarterly book talks to my students, I was super excited because I knew that she could expose them to a variety of different texts that she has read and that she knew they would like. So what I did was I corresponded each genre with what we were doing during our lesson, which would take place during the second block of class. So in quarter 1, you can see that I paired a memoir with a narrative. I paired informational text with expository writing, fiction writing with analysis and argumentative writing, and then in quarter 4, it was free choice. Whatever the students enjoyed the most, they could just choose. That little picture over on the right are all the different memoirs that the teen librarian book talked to my students. And she always created a list just like this for every single book talk that she provided. On Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, students were given anywhere between 15 and 20 minutes to just read. And as long as they were reading, they were fulfilling their responsibility in the classroom. And I will say that very rarely did kids show up to IRB time without their book. They enjoyed their reading time and they would even ask for more. Now, the data to prove that they actually enjoyed their reading time. Here is what their responses were for the first 3 quarters of the school year. For quarter 1 memoir, if you look at 4s and 5s, you can see that 4s and 5s mean that students had pretty high engagement in their text that they were reading. So just by looking at these graphs, and you look at the 4s and you look at the 5s, you can see that all 3 quarters of memoir, informational text, and fiction received really, really high ratings from my students. There were very few 2s or 3s. And if you look at it, there were 0 1s. 1 is the very lowest that it could go. So this data really does help to prove that students' desire and engagement certainly improve when students are provided with guided choices to make about their own reading material. You might be wondering how the data of student-selected text compares to teacher-selected text. Well, in quarter 1, when the students were reading their memoirs, and as a class we were reading a lot of different narratives, the data wasn't that different. Narratives seemed to really grab the attention of students. The same thing was true in quarter 3, where we read A Christmas Carol and The Hunger Games. Both of those books right there, or play and book right there, they both are very high interest stories. The genre that showed a tremendous difference, and I mean tremendous, was informational text. That seems to be the genre where my students, it was most critical for them to be able to pick out their book. If you look at these charts right here, on the left you see the teacher selected informational text, and on the right you see the student selected informational text. Where students on the teacher selected informational text side, they only had good or strong or extremely high engagement 12.5% of the time. And that is that little light purple wedge down there at the bottom. Whereas when they were able to select their own informational text to read, you can see that they had 66.7% good engagement. And then where there wasn't any of this color on the left side of the chart, 13.9% of them had extremely high engagement in their student selected informational text. Only 5.6 of them gave it an extremely low or below average, whereas the teacher selected text over here got 62.5% extremely low or below average engagement. So these numbers really show how important it is to allow students to make choices when they read informational text. In addition to independent reading, the second thing that I instituted in my classroom that was also inspired by Gallagher is the Reading Minute. And if you don't know what the Reading Minute is, I would encourage you to go take a look at these links at your own convenience sometime and it'll explain it. But in a nutshell, what the Reading Minute is a teacher begins and brings in a piece of text that should take under a minute to read. And you present it to the class and you ask them to write a one-sentence response to it. And when I implemented this, I had no idea the buzz that it would actually create. So for the first month, I modeled for my students what I expected for them. I brought in a variety of different types of reading materials, from infographics to articles to essays to quotes to little stories. And then they took over, and they did an absolutely incredible job too. After about a month, and I opened up a Google Doc for them to sign up for, where they would present their reading minute to the class, the very first spots were filled immediately. So there was a lot of excitement to go ahead and get started with this. Here are some of the sample reading minutes that they chose to bring in to share with their peers. I really, really love the one on the left. I'd never heard of it before. And then the question that the student posed to the class was, what does this mean to you? Another student, a huge college football fan, obviously, brought in an infographic that talks about the primary football team in each state in the United States, and then asked students if they agreed or disagreed with the map. Another student who loves grammar brought in a reading minute for why she still likes to use the Oxford comma, and so do I. Thank you very much, little student. And then finally, I love the starfish story. I have heard this story before, but had forgotten about it. And another one of my students brought this story in. So these are just samples of the reading minutes that they chose to bring in to share with each other. And as I mentioned, it created quite a buzz in the classroom. Students would race to the Google Doc to sign up for their reading minute as soon as I shared it with them. I really believe that excellent samples of a variety of texts were shared. Maybe once or twice did someone show up on the day that they were supposed to present without their reading minute. Many students wanted to do a second one. No one tried to get out of doing this, not even my shyest students, which I was quite impressed with. So not one tried to get out of presenting a reading minute to their peers. And then what really, really shocked me, and I loved because I understood how much they loved a reading minute, is they would email me samples to use for my next year students when I was modeling it for them once again. So did the reading minute create a lot of engagement in my classroom? It absolutely did. Okay, now that all the buzz was created with reading and I felt like I was on track to ending the read-aside that was happening in the classroom and that had been happening for 10 years, I shifted gears and I focused on writing. If you look at the schedule once again, you will see that on Tuesdays, it's something that we called Free Write Mentor Text. It ended up being called Mentor Text Tuesday. So what Mentor Text Tuesday was I would bring in a mentor text. And all of my mentor texts, well, I would say most of them came from Linda Reef's books called 100 Quick Writes. And what we would do is we would try to read like a reader and read like a writer. And this was a really difficult concept for my students to understand because I felt like they had a good idea of how to read like a reader. Like as readers, they do all these things. But when they were reading writing, they didn't really do these things. So when I asked them, what do you notice about this poem? They would say the most obvious things like it's 3 stanzas or it's about a sport. No one really got into ideas and voice and sentence fluency and the word choice that was being used. So reading like a writer was something that we had to work on for a very long time before we got good at it. So for our other 2 writing days of the week, Wednesday and Thursday, where they each received 10 to 15 minutes per day, students could decide to stick with their piece that they started on Tuesday, or they could free write about whatever they wanted. The only thing that they knew was that they were going to have a portfolio due in March and in May that required them to pick some of the mentor text pieces that they had been working on throughout the year. So if they liked the mentor text that they started on a Tuesday, that might be a piece that they would turn into their portfolio. But if they didn't like it, there was no pressure to try and write a poem or whatever sort of mentor text it was to be just like that. So here's an example over on the right of piano that one of my students created based off of the mentor text Hockey. And hopefully you've been reading it while I've been talking because it is tremendous. It's hard to believe that a 7th grader actually wrote this. As you can see, the mentor text was only 3 stanzas long, but this girl made hers 6. And she does a really good job reading like a writer and incorporating so much of what was done in the original mentor text. Many of my 7th graders were able to create pieces like this, simply inspired by one of the mentor texts that we were choosing to analyze on Tuesdays. Even though I had not intended to carry over the usage of mentor text into the lesson of my classroom, because it was working so well with teaching my students how to read like readers and writers, I decided to do so. So Allison Marchetti and Rebecca Odell's book, Writing with Mentors, really helped me to understand how to do this. So for my students' narrative unit, back in quarter 1, we immersed ourselves in a bunch of different narratives. We looked at Owl Moon, Fireflies, Gary Soto's The Jacket, and a couple more different stories. By looking at these mentor texts, my students could define what a narrative was before I even told them what a narrative was. At the same time, they were noticing a lot of different writing techniques that these incredible writers were using. If I had more time, I would take you to my Google Doc and show you a narrative that starts the story in 4 different ways. And I wouldn't tell the students this yet, but they would hopefully be able to recognize that in one of the ways that the writer starts the story, he or she uses a lot of sensory description of setting. In another way, there's a lot of action. The third way was there are inner thoughts of a character being revealed. And in the fourth way, there was dialogue and an engaging conversation. Then after they took a look at all 4 of those methods, they could decide which 2 they wanted to use as they experimented with writing the lead to their narrative story. So they were inspired by a mentor text, and then they were allowed to make the choice as to which 2 ways might work best for their own narrative. And I was interested in their feedback. I was wondering if they liked being forced to choose one of these ways to start their paper, or if it was too overwhelming to them. So I asked them if they agreed or disagreed with, I think my narrative will be better if I didn't have to pick one of the 4 leads that I learned today. 3 out of 4 of them, or 75% of them, said false, meaning 3 out of 4 liked being directed as to how to start their paper. We also went through this same process for their narrative endings. And you can see that 51.4% of them said that they feel a lot more confident about having strategies to start and end their paper. And then 40% of them said yes, it does help their confidence a little. And only 8.6% of my students said that they would have preferred to start their paper and end their paper however they want. So the data does show that my students' attitude towards writing and their confidence, it improves when they are able to make guided choices within their writing. Here are 3 leads that my students wrote. 3 different types. The first one is a sensory description. The second one's dialogue and action. And the third one is inner thoughts. And I think that if you read through these, you will just hear the description, the adjective word choice, the sentence fluency, some onomatopoeia, questions, suspense. There's just so much going on in these student samples that in my previous years of teaching without mentor texts and without guiding them to writing in certain ways and with certain styles, that these far surpassed anything that my students have ever done in the past. And the same can be true for the whole narrative that they wrote, and really for all the other academic writings that we did throughout the rest of the year as well. So I'm a huge believer in making students analyze mentor texts, notice trends and styles and crafts that the authors are using, and letting them choose which ones they want to bring into their own writing. So as I conclude today, I would just like to remind you what my research question was. It was, how does providing guided choices in reading and writing improve engagement and growth? And the final book that I used is by a man named A.J. Giuliani called Learning by Choice. And this is really what I learned. He sums it up beautifully when he says, if you learn only for external, extrinsic reasons, you will probably forget it as soon as you are no longer forced to remember what you want to do. And I really do think that before I changed my methods of teaching, my students were learning to get an A. They were learning to become part of National Honor Society. They were learning to get praise from their parents and teachers. Going back to Giuliani, nor will you be motivated to learn for its own sake. Whereas, if you are intrinsically motivated, you're going to keep learning as you move up, and so you are in this lifelong learning mode, which would be ideal. So in conclusion, what I see this is that choice, offering students choices, drives their intrinsic motivation. And when they have that intrinsic motivation, they're going to learn. And when they're learning, they are growing. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation.